April 24th, 1916. Dublin, just after dawn. A pale gray light settles over Sackville Street. The city is unusually still. Tram lines glisten from a night of rain. Shop shutters remain closed. Then, through the damp morning air, church bells begin to toll, slow, deliberate, echoing across the River Liffey. Their sound rolls over stone buildings that have stood for centuries, over cobblestones worn smooth by generations who walked them in hope, in hunger, in silence. At the General Post Office, a small group of men steps forward. Rifles are raised. A green, white, and orange flag climbs into the wind. Its fabric trembles against the sky. Within hours, Dublin will be under artillery fire. Within days, the rebellion will be crushed. But in this single moment, beneath the bells, beneath the rising flag, 5,000 years of memory stand upright. The uprising did not begin that morning. It began long before stone cathedrals, before English rule, before even the written word reached the island. To understand Easter 1916, we must return to the beginning, to the first people who crossed the narrow seas and set foot on a quiet, green land at the edge of Europe. Long before empires carved borders across Europe, Ireland stood apart, a green island shaped by wind, stone, and sea. Around 3000 BCE, farming communities had already settled its river valleys and uplands. They cleared forests with stone axes. They built timber homes. And in the Boyne Valley, they raised something that would outlast them all, Newgrange, a circular mound of earth and stone, aligned precisely with the winter solstice sunrise. Each year, for a few brief minutes, a narrow beam of light pierces its inner chamber. The builders left no written language, yet their understanding of astronomy, ritual, and permanence remains unmistakable. Ireland's story begins not in chaos, but in calculation, in a people who measured time against the sun itself. Centuries passed. Bronze replaced stone. Trade routes stretched across the Irish Sea. Then, sometime after 500 BCE, waves of Celtic-speaking peoples reshaped the island's culture. Gaelic language, oral law, warrior aristocracies, and tribal kingship took root. Ireland did not unify under a single crown. Instead, it became a mosaic of Taatha, small kingdoms bound by allegiance, cattle wealth, and honor. Power was personal. Authority flowed from lineage and land. The High King at Tara symbolized unity, but real control remained local. Poets and druids guarded memory. Law was preserved not in stone tablets, but in recited verse. This was an Ireland without cities, without Roman occupation. While Roman legions marched across Britain, Ireland remained beyond imperial reach, peripheral yet untouched. Its isolation preserved culture. It also made the island vulnerable to sudden change. In the 5th century, a new force arrived, not with swords, but with scripture. Among the missionaries was St. Patrick, a Romano-British cleric who had once been enslaved on Irish soil. His mission, and those who followed him, transformed the island's spiritual landscape. Pagan shrines gave way to monasteries. Stone crosses rose from grassy plains. Latin entered the scholarly vocabulary. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Ireland had become one of Europe's great centers of Christian learning. Monastic settlements at Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, and Iona became hubs of literacy and theology. Illuminated manuscripts, including the later Book of Kells, testified to a fusion of Celtic artistry and Christian devotion. In a Europe descending into post-Roman fragmentation, Ireland gained a reputation as the island of saints and scholars. Irish monks traveled across the continent, founding monasteries in Gaul, Germany, and Italy. For a time, Ireland exported faith and learning rather than conflict. But the sea that once protected, it would soon carry a different kind of visitor. In 795 CE, raiders struck the monastery of Lambay Island. They came in long ships, narrow vessels slicing through Atlantic waves. They moved quickly without warning. Gold, livestock, captives. Monasteries, rich in manuscripts and precious objects, became targets. The Vikings had arrived. For 2 centuries, Norse raiders and settlers altered Ireland's political balance. Coastal settlements like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick began as Viking strongholds. Over time, they evolved into trade centers, linking Ireland to Scandinavia and beyond. Ironically, The invaders who plundered monasteries also introduced urban life to the island. Gaelic kings adapted. Alliances shifted. Battles were fought not only against Norse leaders, but among Irish dynasties themselves. In 1014, at the Battle of Clontarf, High King Brian Boru confronted a coalition of Viking and Irish rivals. Though Brian was killed, Norse political dominance weakened. The Gaelic order reasserted itself. Yet Ireland had changed. It was no longer an isolated rural society. It was connected, economically, militarily, culturally, to the wider European world. Its monasteries had flourished. Its cities had formed. Its kings had warred without ever achieving permanent unity. The church bells that rang across Ireland's valleys symbolized spiritual cohesion. But politically, the island remained divided. That division would prove decisive in the centuries to come, because the next invasion would not raid and leave. It would stay. In 1169, ships appeared again on Ireland's southeastern coast. They did not carry Norse raiders. They carried armored knights from Wales and Normandy, veterans of a different political world. Their arrival began not as a conquest order from London, but as an invitation born from Irish rivalry. Diarmait Mac Murchada, a deposed king of Leinster, sought foreign support to reclaim his throne. He turned to Norman lords, promising land and titles in exchange for military aid. Among them was Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow. The intervention was swift and effective. Towns fell, territories shifted hands. What began as mercenary assistance quickly became something larger. In 1171, King Henry II of England crossed into Ireland to assert authority over the Norman adventurers. With that arrival, Ireland entered the orbit of the English crown. For centuries afterward, control remained uneven. English authority centered around the Pale, a fortified region around Dublin. Beyond it, Gaelic lords retained power. Many Norman settlers assimilated, adopting Irish customs and language. Medieval Ireland became a hybrid landscape, Gaelic and Anglo-Norman, interwoven yet uneasy. The balance shifted dramatically in the 16th century. The Tudor monarchy sought centralized control across its realms. Ireland, long semi-autonomous, was viewed as both a threat and an opportunity. Under Henry VIII and later Elizabeth I, the English crown began systematic efforts to subdue Gaelic lords and replace their authority. The policy was deliberate: confiscation of land, plantation of loyal settlers, suppression of traditional leadership. Nowhere was this more transformative than in Ulster, after the defeat of Gaelic chieftains in the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603. Vast tracts of northern land were seized. Protestant settlers from England and Scotland were granted estates. This became known as the Plantation of Ulster. Land ownership shifted along religious and political lines. A Protestant landholding class emerged, aligned with the English crown. The native Catholic population was increasingly marginalized, economically, legally, socially. Religion and land fused into identity. The 17th century deepened the fracture. During the English Civil War, Ireland became a battleground for competing allegiances. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell landed with a parliamentarian army. His campaign was brutal. Towns such as Drogheda and Wexford suffered massacres. Catholic land ownership collapsed further under subsequent settlements. By the early 18th century, a Protestant ascendancy dominated Irish political and economic life. The penal laws restricted Catholic rights, limiting land ownership, education, and political participation. The Irish Parliament in Dublin existed, but ultimate authority rested in London. Church bells still rang across villages and towns, but they rang differently depending on which church one attended. By the late 18th century, new ideas began to circulate. The American Revolution and the French Revolution introduced concepts of republicanism and popular sovereignty. In 1798, inspired by these currents, the United Irishmen launched a rebellion seeking independence from Britain. It was suppressed with force. In 1801, the Act of Union formally abolished the Irish Parliament and integrated Ireland into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Political autonomy vanished. Yet the deepest trauma of the 19th century would not come from rebellion. It would come from hunger. In 1845, a fungal disease, Phytophthora infestans, struck the potato crop. For millions of Irish tenant farmers, the potato was the staple of survival. Over successive years, harvests failed. The catastrophe became known as the Great Famine. Approximately 1 million people died from starvation and disease. Another million emigrated, many to the United States, Canada, and Britain. Entire villages emptied. Workhouses overflowed. Eviction rates soared as landlords enforced rents despite crop collapse. British government relief efforts were widely criticized as insufficient and ideologically constrained. Grain continued to be exported from Ireland during the famine years. The memory hardened into grievance. The island's population fell from over 8 million in the early 1840s to barely 6 million a decade later, and would continue declining for generations. The famine altered Ireland permanently. Demographically, economically, psychologically, emigration became part of national identity. Diaspora communities carried memory across oceans. Songs, letters, and remittances bound the island to distant cities. By the late 19th century, new political movements gained momentum. Demands for land reform intensified. Nationalists pushed for home rule, limited self-government within the United Kingdom. Leaders like Charles Stewart Parnell mobilized mass support through constitutional politics. But beneath parliamentary debate, something deeper was stirring. Cultural revival movements sought to preserve the Irish language, literature, and games. Identity was being reconstructed, not only through protest, but through memory. As Europe moved toward the catastrophe of the First World War, Ireland stood at crossroads. Some believed loyalty to Britain would secure reform. Others believed only rupture would bring freedom. The bells would ring again in 1916. But by then, centuries of land, faith, famine, and frustration had already shaped the moment. By the dawn of the 20th century, Ireland's struggle was no longer defined by a single grievance. It was layered: economic, religious, cultural, political. To understand how rebellion became inevitable, one must examine the forces that shaped everyday life beneath the surface of parliamentary debate. The first was the land. For centuries, ownership of Irish soil had symbolized power. After the plantations and Cromwellian settlements, vast estates were held by Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords, many of whom lived in Britain. These absentee landlords collected rents through agents while tenant farmers worked small plots under precarious leases. A single failed harvest could mean eviction. By the 1870s, rural agitation intensified. Secret societies resisted rent payments. The Land League, founded in 1879, demanded fair rents, fixity of tenure, and free sale. Parliamentary pressure and sustained protest led to a series of land acts, gradually transferring ownership from landlords to tenants. By the early 20th century, much of rural Ireland had shifted toward peasant proprietorship, yet the memory remained. Generations had grown up equating British governance with dispossession. Land was not merely economic property. It was ancestral continuity. To lose it was to lose identity itself. The second force was religion. Ireland's division hardened along confessional lines. The majority Catholic population viewed itself as historically suppressed under Protestant rule. In Ulster, however, Protestant communities, many descended from Scottish settlers, feared that Irish self-government would place them under Catholic dominance. Churches stood not only as places of worship, but as political markers. The ringing of bells on Sunday mornings signaled belonging. In rural villages, the parish priest often carried moral authority beyond the altar. In Protestant districts of Belfast, Presbyterian and Anglican congregations anchored industrial communities. Faith intertwined with voting patterns, schooling, and social life. Thus, when debates over home rule intensified in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were not abstract constitutional disputes. They touched on existential fears. To Catholics in the South and West, home rule meant dignity restored. To many Protestants in the North, it suggested cultural extinction. The third force was rebellion as tradition. Ireland's resistance did not begin in 1916. It echoed through earlier generations. In 1798, the United Irishmen had attempted to unite Catholic and Protestant under Republican ideals, inspired by revolutionary France. Though defeated, their memory endured. In 1803, Robert Emmet led a failed uprising in Dublin. In 1848, young Ireland nationalists staged a short-lived revolt. In 1867, the Fenian Brotherhood attempted another insurrection. Each effort collapsed militarily. Each left behind martyrs. Execution sites became places of remembrance. Songs carried names forward. Commemorations sustained grievance. The pattern repeated: rebellion, suppression, commemoration. Over time, defeat itself became formative. By the early 1900s, younger nationalists looked backward not with embarrassment, but with reverence. Sacrifice acquired moral authority. The idea that bloodshed could awaken national consciousness gained traction. Meanwhile, constitutional politics struggled. The Home Rule Bill, introduced repeatedly in Westminster, faced fierce resistance from Unionists. In 1912, Ulster Unionists signed the Solemn League and Covenant, pledging to oppose Home Rule by any means necessary. Paramilitary groups formed on both sides, the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish Volunteers. Ireland was arming, and then, in August 1914, Europe descended into total war. The First World War suspended implementation of Home Rule. Thousands of Irishmen enlisted in British regiments, believing service would strengthen Ireland's claim to autonomy. Others saw the war as opportunity. Britain distracted, vulnerable. The old cycle of land grievances, religious division, and remembered rebellion converged. The church bells still rang across Dublin and Belfast, but beneath their familiar sound, a new generation was preparing not for petitions, but for insurrection. By the early 20th century, Ireland's struggle had entered a decisive intellectual phase. Armed resistance was only one path. Another unfolded in parliamentary chambers, newspapers, lecture halls, and cultural societies. The fourth force shaping Ireland's future was political strategy. For decades, constitutional nationalists pursued reform through Westminster. At the center of this movement stood Charles Stewart Parnell. Calm, disciplined, and relentless, Parnell transformed Irish politics in the 1880s. He mobilized mass support through the Irish Parliamentary Party, aligning land reform with Home Rule. Under his leadership, Irish MPs obstructed British parliamentary proceedings, forcing the Irish question into the heart of imperial politics. Though Parnell's career collapsed amid personal scandal in 1890, he had proven something vital. Ireland could command attention through organized, democratic pressure. Yet constitutional progress was fragile. Home Rule bills introduced in 1886 and 1893 failed. A third bill passed in 1912 but was suspended due to the outbreak of war in 1914. Many nationalists felt reform was always promised and always deferred. Parallel to political agitation emerged a quieter but equally transformative movement: cultural revival. This was the fifth force. In 1893, the Gaelic League was founded to preserve and promote the Irish language. Writers, poets, and scholars sought to reclaim myths, folklore, and traditional music. Athletic associations revived indigenous sports like hurling and Gaelic football. The message was subtle but powerful. Ireland was not merely a territory within the United Kingdom. It was a civilization with its own heritage. Cultural nationalism reshaped identity from within. Language classes met in small halls. Plays performed at the Abbey Theatre dramatized rural life and heroic legends. The Irish tricolor, green for Catholic tradition, orange for Protestant heritage, white for peace between them, symbolized aspiration toward unity. Through literature and sport, Ireland reimagined itself as distinct. The sixth and final force was war, not on Irish soil at first, but across Europe. When the First World War began, over 200,000 Irishmen would serve in British forces. Some believed loyalty would secure post-war autonomy. Others saw the war as proof of imperial entanglement. In Ulster, Unionist volunteers joined British divisions with enthusiasm. In nationalist regions, motivations were divided. As casualty lists lengthened, from Gallipoli to the Somme, grief spread through Irish towns. Church bells tolled for fallen soldiers. Yet even as Irish regiments fought in Flanders, a smaller group at home prepared for a different conflict. The Irish volunteers fractured. A minority, influenced by the secretive Irish Republican Brotherhood, concluded that Britain's preoccupation with continental war created a rare strategic opening. Armed shipments were organized, plans drafted quietly. To some, Rebellion during wartime appeared reckless. To others, it felt like destiny. By early 1916, the strands had woven together: land memory, religious division, parliamentary frustration, cultural revival, and global war. Ireland stood on the edge of a decision that would alter its course permanently. The bells that had once called monks to prayer, that had tolled for famine dead, that had echoed during earlier rebellions, would soon ring again over a capital city transformed into a battlefield. And this time, the consequences would reverberate far beyond Dublin streets. April 24th, 1916, Easter Monday. Shortly before noon, members of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army moved into position across Dublin. Strategic buildings were seized: the General Post Office, the Four Courts, Boland's Mill, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, St. Stephen's Green. Their numbers totaled roughly 1,600 insurgents across the city and surrounding areas. The plan had been compromised by confusion and countermanded orders, reducing nationwide participation. What unfolded would be concentrated largely in the capital. At the General Post Office, Patrick Pearse stepped forward and read the proclamation of the Irish Republic. The document declared Ireland's right to sovereignty and equal citizenship. It named a provisional government. It invoked the dead generations from whom the nation received its tradition of nationhood. The tricolor rose above the GPO. Initial British response was uncertain. Many soldiers stationed in Ireland were inexperienced reservists. Reinforcements were rushed from England. By midweek, artillery pieces were positioned on the north side of the River Liffey. Naval gunboat Helga shell positions from the water. Dublin became a war zone. Heavy bombardment reduced large sections of Sackville Street to rubble. Fire spread uncontrollably. Civilians were caught in crossfire. Hundreds would be killed or wounded. British troop numbers swelled to over 16,000, supported by artillery and machine guns. The rebels, lightly armed and isolated, faced overwhelming force. Within the GPO, conditions deteriorated. Communications faltered. Ammunition dwindled. Buildings around them collapsed under shelling. On April 29th, after 6 days of fighting, Pearse ordered surrender to prevent further civilian casualties. Militarily, the rebellion had failed. Over 450 people were killed, more than half of them civilians. Approximately 2,600 were wounded. Large portions of central Dublin lay in ruins. Public reaction in the immediate aftermath was complex. Some Dubliners, angered by destruction and loss of life, expressed hostility toward the rebels as they were marched away under guard. But the British response altered perception. Between May 3rd and May 12th, 15 leaders of the rising were executed by a firing squad in Kilmainham Gaol. Among them were Patrick Pearse and James Connolly, the latter severely wounded and reportedly strapped to a chair before execution. Over 3,000 suspected sympathizers were arrested, many deported to internment camps in Britain. The executions transformed defeat into martyrdom. Newspapers carried names. Families mourned publicly. What had appeared a reckless uprising began to resemble sacrifice. The language of the proclamation circulated more widely in death than it had in life. The bells that had tolled during the week of fighting now tolled again, this time for men facing rifle volleys in prison yards. Public opinion shifted steadily. By 1917 and 1918, a political realignment was underway. The party Sinn Féin, though not originally responsible for planning the rising, became associated with its legacy and adopted its Republican vision. The British government, seeking to introduce conscription in Ireland in 1918 to support the war effort, encountered unified resistance. Opposition cut across social lines, further strengthening nationalist sentiment. In the general election of December 1918, Sinn Féin won 73 of Ireland's 105 parliamentary seats. Instead of taking those seats in Westminster, elected representatives convened in Dublin in January 1919, declaring an independent assembly Dáil Éireann. The stage shifted from symbolic proclamation to organized conflict. The rising had not liberated Ireland. It had altered its political psychology. It proved that armed defiance, even if militarily futile, could reshape narrative and identity. And within months, violence would resume, this time in more sustained, coordinated form. January 21st, 1919. On the same day, elected Irish representatives assembled in Dublin to declare independence. A small unit of Irish volunteers, now increasingly referred to as the Irish Republican Army, ambushed two members of the Royal Irish Constabulary at Soloheadbeg in County Tipperary. The policemen were killed. The War of Independence had begun. Unlike the Easter Rising, this conflict would not center on fixed positions or symbolic buildings. It would unfold in lanes, crossroads, rural barracks, and narrow city streets. It would be fluid, decentralized, and relentless. Leadership shifted toward figures skilled not in proclamation, but in organization. Among them was Michael Collins, appointed Director of Intelligence for the IRA and later Minister for Finance in the Revolutionary Government. Collins developed an intelligence network inside Dublin Castle, the administrative center of British authority in Ireland. Informants, couriers, sympathizers within clerical offices. Information flowed quietly. IRA units adopted guerrilla tactics, ambushes, targeted assassinations, raids for arms. Police barracks in isolated rural areas were attacked and burned, forcing the Royal Irish Constabulary to consolidate into defensible towns. By late 1919, hundreds of barracks had been abandoned. British authorities responded with reinforcements. In 1920, auxiliary forces composed largely of former British soldiers were deployed. They became known as the Black and Tans, and the Auxiliary Division. Their reprisals for IRA attacks were often indiscriminate, burning homes, businesses, and creameries. Civilian casualties mounted. Violence escalated on both sides. In November 1920, Collins's intelligence unit targeted British agents in Dublin in a coordinated operation. 14 men were shot in their lodgings that morning. Hours later, British forces opened fire during a Gaelic football match at Croke Park, killing 14 civilians in what became known as Bloody Sunday. Retaliation and counter-retaliation hardened attitudes. By 1921, the conflict had spread widely across Munster and parts of Leinster. Railway lines were sabotaged. Tax collection faltered. The British government faced mounting costs, financial, military, political. International opinion, particularly in the United States where Irish diaspora communities were influential, applied additional pressure. Estimates suggest approximately 1,500 people were killed during the War of Independence, including civilians, IRA members, British soldiers, and police. In July 1921, a truce was declared. Negotiations followed in London. The resulting Anglo-Irish Treaty, signed in December 1921, established the Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion within the British Commonwealth. It required an oath of allegiance to the British monarch. Crucially, it allowed 6 counties in Ulster to opt out, formalizing partition. Northern Ireland remained within the United Kingdom. The treaty divided Irish leadership. Michael Collins argued it provided the freedom to achieve freedom. Others, including Eamon de Valera, opposed the oath and the acceptance of partition. The Dáil ratified the treaty by a narrow margin. Disagreement turned violent. In June 1922, civil war erupted between pro-treaty and anti-treaty forces. Former comrades now faced each other across barricades. The conflict lasted less than a year, but proved deeply bitter. Michael Collins was killed in an ambush in August 1922. By May 1923, anti-treaty forces ceased operations. The Irish Free State survived, but at significant cost. The Cycle Rebellion had achieved partial independence, yet unity remained unresolved. Northern Ireland developed separately, with its own parliament at Stormont, dominated by a Protestant Unionist majority. Catholic minorities there faced systemic discrimination in housing, employment, and political representation. Thus, the struggle did not end in 1923. It shifted geographically and politically. The bells that rang for independence in Dublin did not ring with the same meaning in Belfast. Partition had redrawn not only borders, but futures. And in the decades ahead, unresolved grievances in the North would reignite violence on a scale that would test both British and Irish governments and reshape the meaning of sovereignty once again. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 did not conclude Ireland's story. It reorganized it. On December 6, 1922, the Irish Free State formally came into existence as a dominion within the British Commonwealth. It possessed its own parliament, its own executive council, and authority over most of the island's 26 counties. Yet it remained constitutionally linked to the British Crown. For many in the South, this marked the fulfillment of centuries of struggle. The tricolour now flew not as a symbol of rebellion, but as the flag of a functioning state. Institutions had to be built. Courts, civil services, armed forces, roads, and infrastructure required repair after years of conflict. Emigration continued, but governance had shifted from London to Dublin. However, 6 northeastern counties exercised their right under the treaty to opt out. Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom. A separate parliament convened in Belfast at Stormont. Its political structure reflected demographic realities. A Protestant and Unionist majority determined to preserve union with Britain, and a Catholic nationalist minority concentrated in certain urban and rural districts. The division was more than administrative. In Northern Ireland, electoral boundaries were drawn in ways that reinforced Unionist control. Employment in public services and heavy industries often favored Protestant communities. Housing allocation frequently disadvantaged Catholic families. Policing was entrusted to the Royal Ulster Constabulary, supported by a reserve force known as the B Specials, both perceived by many nationalists as partisan. For decades, this system maintained order, but at the cost of resentment. Meanwhile, in the South, the Free State gradually distanced itself from remaining British ties. In 1937, a new constitution renamed the state Ireland and asserted a territorial claim over the entire island. In 1949, Ireland formally declared itself a republic and left the Commonwealth, yet the border remained. Through the mid-20th century, Northern Ireland experienced industrial development, particularly in shipbuilding and linen manufacturing. Belfast's skyline reflected this economic activity. But beneath economic change, political representation remained uneven. Nationalists participated in elections, but saw little alteration in power structures. By the 1960s, global currents of civil rights activism influenced Northern Irish Catholics, who organized peaceful demonstrations demanding equal voting rights, fair housing, and an end to discriminatory practices. Marches were met with counter-protests and, at times, forceful policing. Television brought images of clashes into living rooms across Britain and Ireland. Tension escalated. In August 1969, widespread rioting in Derry and Belfast overwhelmed local police capacity. The British government deployed troops to restore order. Initially welcomed by some Catholic communities as protectors, the British Army soon became another participant in an increasingly polarized environment. Paramilitary organizations revived. The Irish Republican Army split into factions, including the Provisional IRA, which adopted a campaign of armed resistance against British forces and Unionist institutions. Loyalist paramilitary groups also mobilized, targeting nationalist civilians. Bombings, shootings, and assassinations became recurring features of daily life. Urban centers were scarred by barricades and checkpoints. Neighborhoods segregated further along communal lines. What had once been framed as a constitutional disagreement hardened into protracted conflict. The bells still rang in churches across Belfast and Derry, but their sound often mingled with sirens. By the early 1970s, Northern Ireland had entered what would become known simply as the Troubles. In January 1972, during a civil rights march in Derry, British soldiers opened fire on unarmed demonstrators. 14 people were killed. The event became known as Bloody Sunday. It intensified recruitment to the Provisional IRA and deepened mistrust between nationalist communities and the British state. International criticism mounted. The British government suspended the Northern Ireland Parliament at Stormont later that year and imposed direct rule from London. Violence escalated through the decade. The Provisional IRA conducted bombing campaigns targeting British military installations, economic infrastructure, and political figures. Loyalist paramilitary groups retaliated with attacks on Catholic civilians. Between 1969 and the late 1990s, more than 3,500 people will be killed and tens of thousands injured. Major incidents punctuated the conflict. car bombs in Belfast city centre, attacks in London, assassinations of officials, hunger strikes by imprisoned Republicans in 1981. During those hunger strikes, Bobby Sands, an IRA prisoner, was elected to the British Parliament while on strike and later died after 66 days without food. His death became a rallying point for Republican communities. Security presence intensified. Checkpoints divided neighborhoods. Surveillance became routine. Yet even amid violence, political dialogue continued intermittently. Successive British and Irish governments recognized that a purely military solution was unattainable. By the 1990s, fatigue with conflict was widespread. Secret back-channel communications between the British government and Republican representatives laid groundwork for ceasefires. In 1994, the IRA announced a cessation of military operations, though it would later temporarily collapse. Negotiations resumed with renewed urgency. On April 10, 1998, an agreement was reached, the Good Friday Agreement. It established a devolved power-sharing assembly in Northern Ireland, recognized the principle of consent regarding constitutional status, and created cross-border institutions between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It also included provisions for prisoner release, police reform, and the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons. In referendums held north and south of the border, voters overwhelmingly endorsed the accord. The agreement did not erase memory. It did not dissolve identity differences, but it institutionalized compromise. It acknowledged that sovereignty in Ireland would be shaped not by unilateral declarations, but by democratic consent. In the decades that followed, violence declined dramatically. Political crises would occur, institutions would suspend and resume, yet the large-scale armed campaign subsided. Belfast transformed. Barriers known as peace walls still stand in parts of the city, reminders of division, but commerce, tourism, and cultural life expanded. The Republic of Ireland, meanwhile, experienced significant economic growth in the late 20th century, joining the European Economic Community in 1973 and benefiting from integration into European markets. The island that once exported millions through famine now attracted investment and migration. Universities expanded. Technology firms established offices in Dublin and Cork. Demographic patterns shifted. Yet the border remained a delicate line, rendered nearly invisible after 1998 through cooperative arrangements, but politically sensitive. Debates over identity, sovereignty, and alignment with Britain or Europe continued, particularly following the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union in 2016. Through 5 millennia, Ireland had endured invasion, plantation, famine, partition, and insurgency. Its history moved in cycles of loss and assertion, suppression and revival. And still, across towns and villages, church bells ring, no longer as signals of uprising or curfew, but as ordinary markers of time. For 5,000 years, Ireland has stood at the western edge of Europe, never fully isolated, never fully absorbed. From the builders of Newgrange who aligned stone with the winter sun, to the monks who illuminated manuscripts in candlelit scriptoria, from Gaelic chieftains defending ancestral land to revolutionaries reading a proclamation beneath a rising tricolor, the island's history has been shaped by memory as much as by force. Empires came with armor and law. Plantations redrew ownership. Famine emptied valleys. Partition divided neighbors. Bombings fractured streets that had once echoed only with market carts and church hymns. Yet something endured. Language survived in whispered classrooms. Songs preserved the names of the fallen. Political defeat transformed into moral resolve. Even in division, identity persisted, contested, redefined, but never erased. The sound of church bells threads through it all. They rang in monastic Ireland. They tolled during famine burials. They echoed over Dublin in 1916. They sounded again during funerals in Belfast decades later. Today, they ring without artillery in reply. Ireland's history is not a simple march toward independence, nor a single story of victimhood or triumph. It is a long negotiation between land and power, faith and politics, memory and modernity. It reveals how identity can harden under pressure, and how compromise can emerge from exhaustion. Freedom, in Ireland's case, did not arrive in a single decisive moment. It formed slowly, imperfectly, across generations willing to endure loss without surrendering narrative. At the edge of the Atlantic, where wind moves through green fields older than recorded history, the island remains shaped by struggle, defined by resilience, and sustained by a belief that sovereignty is not only territory, but memory carried forward.